Greetings. This report seeks to be an accurate analysis of a pretty common problem that we come across today. And that problem is essentially, should employers be allowed to terminate somebody based on the content of their social media posts? And now before we can really analyze this topic, we really have to dispel some ideas and also gain some insight on the current structure of the problem. Basically, how does the legal system interpret speech or content that we output online? The simple question to that is that speech output online, as seen in the slide, is the exact same thing as speech said in person or verbally. And so on the left we see people texting with their phones, and on the right we see people talking in person. These are both essentially the exact same thing as far as the law is concerned. And this is more so an important base level understanding that we have to come to, but it allows us to see that the existing laws that surround speech are what's going to be looked at and implemented following this sequence right here. So we'll go on to this next slide, which is following into the retortions that I was needing to make in the beginning. And that would be the First Amendment. Essentially, the First Amendment, it seems to be overrepresented in this instance, and it's understandable as to why. In many instances, the First Amendment does have protections for a lot of different circumstances, but in this instance, the First Amendment has a scope of what it will and will not protect. And when our founding fathers wrote this amendment in the 1700s, the sole cause of it, for it to protect us, was to be protected from the government. The government was not allowed to infringe upon our speech. And that was what was outlined. They were not allowed to infringe upon our speech in the form of the government or any governmental agency / entity. And so this should raise the question, well, if I don't work for the government, then does the First Amendment apply to me? And the question in that case is no. And this is basically where the big dividing line will come. You have to ask yourself, okay, so am I a public employee or am I a private employee? For general just categorization purposes, using these terms. But you'll see in this slide right here to the left, this is a private employee. This is someone that's most likely us. Unless you work for either the military or the government, you are under the private, you're on the left side of this slide, and you work under the private sector with everyone else. So if someone says they work for Amazon or Google or Facebook, or they work with your Uncle Bob in the woods, they are on the private side of this entire thing. And then likewise, or contrary, to the right we have the government employees. And so unless you're on the right side, unless you're on the public side, then the speech that you say is not protected. But if you do work for the government, then there is nothing that the government can do as a basis of what you have said or expressed that they can infringe upon. Because at that point, the Founding Fathers' First Amendment will come into play. We'll go on to this next portion though, but it's crucial to understand that this is one variable that has to be considered. We'll also go into this next slide, and we'll see that there also is the idea of expression online. So when we see speech online, that's a pretty simple case. We can say, okay, this is what they said, this is what they meant. But expression is something that we also have to consider. And expression is simply something that symbolizes intent. And that intent could be anything. A very common or easier example for me to get across would be the like button. The like button, it's not necessarily an explicit communication, but it kind of gives you or conveys an idea. It gives you an idea. And that's basically what an expression is. And so within the slide, we're using sort of an example, but just saying, person A saying, whoa, surprise, she sent that sequence of emojis, so it implies something, and then the person B will say, well, I haven't technically said anything explicitly though, so I'm good, right? And that's what they're thinking, is what it's supposed to be representing. But basically this is saying that in this case, the person needs to see that unless it doesn't matter if it's explicitly or implicitly addressed, it will still be considered in the eyes of the law. There is expression, there is intent with whatever he or she said, and I was going to say too, the arrows denote that it could be either gender. It's not the basis of the argument, but expression is considered though within what the law looks at online. Just like it would with verbal speech or verbal implications. So we'll go on to the next slide. That's more of a disclaimer too. And then this is more of an animation of the real world example of the previous slide, where you have the government job on the left, and it's showing you, well, in this case, the knight would be representing protections by the law over speech. So it's not so much the government that's being represented by the knight, it's more so protections. But we'll see in this case that the protections will be enacted for a government employee on the left, because the First Amendment has got them. But then we'll see on the right side right here that the private employee is not quite as lucky, and the protections are basically gone, the guy's gone to sleep. But basically we come to this idea where we see within this next slide that employers, or people that are a business entity, have a lot of autonomy or liberty in what they can say and do to their employees, and that's not wrong. It's very true, but it's crucial, and that's crucial, as attorney Grant Alexander noted, that the First Amendment does not apply to private actors, and employers are those private actors. And so it's sort of a weird way to see it, but it's something that we have to come to grips with, that it's not this centralized force that regulates us, that employers they have their own wants and needs and intentions. They're the artificers of what they're trying to create. And so with that, yeah, the First Amendment basically does not cover that. But not all is fine and dandy, though. This might give you the idea that employers have a lot of liberty to basically say and do whatever they want to their employees. That's not quite the case. There are laws enacted that will serve as protections against employees that, if basically they're transgressed against by their religion or their race or their sexual orientation, then the protections will step in. But this is more so seen in a standby sense. We see more so the protections of this being enacted in a standby sense. The law is just going to filter what is said, or the speech that is said within the private sector, and look for instances. If it violates these three fundamental principles, then it will step in. But for the most part, these laws operate on a standby basis, as denoted with the knight to the right. So we'll see also that there's this other issue that is overlooked, it seems, within this scenario, and that is basically the at-will employment doctrine. In the majority of cases, the majority of people, with the person that they work for, they serve under them with an at-will employment doctrine basis, or under an at-will employment doctrine basis. And that essentially means that the employer reserves the right to terminate you for any reason at any given time without a fair amount of reasoning. And it sounds pretty harsh, and it kind of is, but it's going to serve as an example of what I'll get into later with this presentation of the autonomy and the responsibility of employers to maintain what you could say is their image. But within this example, we see this guy to the left who's he's an employee, and he's sort of going to represent maybe a naive employee. And it's just basically saying that he's thinking, oh, well, I've worked here for 30 years, and I'm sure they'll never get rid of me, and they're supposed to ensure my quality of life, yada, yada, yada. So he's feeling a little bit entitled, but also just a little bit like he's, surely after 30 years, I would be good. And I would think most people would honestly think that way too at that point. But the reality of the situation is quite different. And then you see to the right, the employers basically are saying, we've so got to get rid of this guy, and the company is not doing as good with him. And that's basically just alluding to the idea that the needs and the services that are expected of an employer comes first. And if Frank is, say, transgressing against their image, which could be through his speech online, if he's making the company look bad, that's a transgression against the employers. And so they have the right to step in at that point. But also, if he's also not competent, which would address the employer's need to have a good product or a good service, if their output for that is not as good, then that would be another reason that they could get rid of him. And that's where that at-will employment doctrine comes into play. And so we really need to understand that, because it's basically saying, well, if you're already hanging by a string, let's not really rock the boat necessarily with what we say, especially online. But like I said, though, this doesn't allow everyone to have full autonomy over us in every way. One instance where employees are capable of speaking about issues that they want to bring awareness to would be if they were wanting to communicate about their job or the labor conditions that they work in. This is an instance where there are laws, like there were laws previously that were filtering speech. This is an instance where the laws will actually protect people if they're communicating about labor conditions or the conditions of the job. But even still, within the legal system that we have now, the context of how that person would say that is still taken into account. And so we see with this instance a little bit of a humorous instance, but it's just showing that if you're being a little bit of a name caller, or you're just making the company's image look bad, or you're degrading it in any way, well, the context of this would not apply, because at this point the person made an infringement upon the corporation's self-image, or the corporation's responsibility to maintain their image, basically is what it's saying. And so what you have to do within these instances, there is still laws that will protect you, and you can still speak about labor conditions. And it is worth noting too that in this instance, this person was speaking about labor conditions. So you would think, well, this is by law, this is this way, but there's also context that's still being taken into account. And this is super crucial to understand. But in the second instance, though, this would be an instance with the same person where they do it the correct way, if they're approaching it with a very logical manner with the correct intent. And the key word being the correct intent, if they're truly bringing light on the issue through speech just for the sake of coming to a solution, then that's allowed, that's permissible, and a court would actually allow that, supposedly. So, but this is still a super gray area, and it's just worth knowing that this is something that's still having to be continually scrutinized. So all of this sort of comes to this idea of still seeing employers as being able to really do a lot of things. They seem to really operate with a lot of liberty, autonomy, and independence. And what that basically is alluding to is this idea of viewing a corporation or a business as a person, as an individual. And this is the basis of how the law would honestly interpret a corporation. What this means really is the rights of the people have rights, and we can refute that all day, but people have rights, people have intentions, and people have incentives and goals, and they want to strive toward that. And they also have what we could say is responsibility to be successful. And that is the same exact metrics that operate within a corporation or within a business. It's a group of people and systems all operating together, and the things that tie them together are the same things that tie together individuals. And that's what has to be super exposed and understood to really grasp why we do see instances where it looks like employers are giving free rein over things. But what I want to get at with this next slide will sort of give more light on that idea, and that is this idea of corporate social responsibility. Basically, the corporations or a corporation or a business entity has an incentive to be successful. A person, like I said before, is wanting to create something or to be something one day. They have goals, incentive. And so you could say if they have people in their lives that they're responsible for, then that person is responsible for essentially what they tolerate and what they do not tolerate. You could say this is their duty, especially if the others that are around them rely on them. And that's the exact same thing with corporations and businesses. People rely on them because they generate wealth. And when they succeed, it actually allows other people to do well as well. And this is a system that we understand, that we know, and this should hopefully make people see that this is why companies are given this amount of freedom. They're able to basically protect or defend themselves. Because if someone were to come up to you and to say something to belittle you or to lower your image, you would naturally respond or react to protect your image. It's the same thing for corporations and businesses. They have an incentive to do it. And so basically with that quote, it does seem like it's an excuse just to cut people out, but it's crucial to realize that for things to grow and innovate, they have to make changes. And sometimes those changes have to be changes that eliminate or deduce from what was originally there. And so you see to the left, you see just raw marble, and then before they made the changes, that was what it was raw marble, and then after deducing or adding more to something, they were able to come out with the image of what they want this to be. They want their corporation or business to be. And so this is why they have this liberty, because they have the responsibility, because you'll see in this next slide that when the businesses are able to maintain their image and their corporate social responsibility, it greatly impacts their business output, their success, and when that happens, they're able to generate wealth. And when that wealth is able to be generated, it's generated, as you can see in the slide, in the form of people basically being able to have jobs. It's all being direct lined to the private communities, which is basically everybody, us, and we're the ones who reap the benefits of that. And so when they do great, it all adds up. You see the money sign going all the way down, and then you see it equaling out to basically symbolize happier life, a happier world, and basically the tenets of what makes things tick, honestly. And so that's why I would say, and obviously there are a lot of discrepancies through this topic that we have to look at. We have to and it's still worth noting that a lot of corruption happens in this world with businesses and the autonomy that is instilled within the legal system to allow them these incentives. A lot of bad things do happen, but for the most part, we know it's a lot worse when the reverse of this image is taking place. When that wealth accumulation is not being exponentiated and output into the world, we don't see the happy people at the end right there. And so that's sort of why it's important to, before we kind of jump at our guns and feel like, well, we're not able to say anything, we can get fired. It's very important to realize that there are bigger forces at play in a lot of these cases. I hope this has been informative. Thank you.